Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hey, Ask Me Stuff, the show out there where you folks out there in the internet lands get to ask me stuff. My name is Ken Coughlin. I am a Christian apologist coming at you live from Trinity Lutheran Church and School in Joppa, Maryland. I am thrilled to be coming at you live. The last 3 weeks, we just had one thing after another, whether it be snowstorms or scheduling, where we actually had to pre-film the episodes, and we do not need to do that tonight. Yay, we are live. That's the good news. The bad news is those of you that were looking for the episode with special guest worship leader Chris Boggs about is there a minimum standard for worship music are going to have to wait another week. Unfortunately, the scheduling with Mr. Boggs did not work out for that for this week, but I talked to him this morning. I've confirmed he is good to go next week, so that episode will be at the same time slot next Tuesday, 6:30 p.m. I'll have Chris Boggs here with me, and we'll be talking about that question. But tonight we're doing a completely different question, which I will introduce in a moment after I let you know how to get your question on an episode. If you have something you want to know, you want to hear me talk about, and it can be anything about the Bible, Jesus, world religions, atheism, theism, the arguments for God. There's a difficult passage you don't understand that you struggle with, any modern social issues, anything like that. You can get your question on the air, and the way you do that is that you go to this website, trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff. On that website, there is a fillable form for you to fill out. Fill out that form. You can be completely anonymous if you want. You don't have to put your name. Just put what question it is that you would like to see answered here on a future episode of Hey, Ask Me Stuff. And we go through those questions, and we pick one out every week. And you never know. Your question may make it onto a future episode. So, all right. I do want to remind everybody that we had, thanks to all of you out there, we have met our goal, our original goal of hitting to 2,000 subscribers. But that goal was set, we were actually looking to hit it before June 30th. So we majorly hit that goal well in advance. And so last week I announced that we are now setting a new goal. We're still keeping that deadline the same of June 30th. Let's just go for 2,500, folks. Let's see if we can beat our original goal by 500 and get to 2,500 subscribers by June 30th. So if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, do me a favor. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button, hit that little notification bell so you don't miss out on any of the fantastic content we have here on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel. So, before I get into tonight's question, I do have one other thing I want to announce, and this is something that I announced on Facebook. And my personal apologist presence on Facebook, and I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter or X, what you want to call it now, and I'm forgetting one. What am I forgetting? Oh, I have a TikTok profile as well, where I post different apologetics thoughts and everything there. But I announced on there that a project that has literally been years in the making is finally here and has finally come to fruition. And that is that I have been able to take all of the content that I have made. Well, okay, I've been in apologetics since about 1998. So about 26 years now, or coming up on 26 years now. And, fortunately, I like to say that a lot of the content that I produced in the first 10 years of being an apologist has been lost to the ravages of time, and that's probably a good thing. I think I had more enthusiasm than ability back then, and I certainly didn't have the knowledge that I do today. But I actually have, over the years, kept hold of whether it be audio recordings or articles or links to blogs and other things that I've written, articles that I've written, since about 2008 through today. And I've been working for the past several years at consolidating all of these onto a website. I have now successfully done that. The website is hard to remember, I know, kencoughlin.org. That's it, kencoughlin.org. So if you ever want to explore everything on here. You can see is organized by topic area. So I've got, under the apologetics section, we have a bunch of different questions you can look at here. The existence of God, of course, has its whole subsection of just all the different arguments for the existence of God. Faith and science, miracles, postmodernism, all sorts of resources here. And you go down to the Bible study, and we have, different biblical interpretation dating, different resources on Bible difficulties, which is where this podcast will be going once it's done. Old Testament, and we have some resources on some particular books as well. Book reviews. I've done some book reviews. I got another one coming out here actually in 2 days, I think. Christian living, so different, just life, doubt, fear, things that we all deal with in our Christian walk, and then different topics when it comes to Christian theology. We got a whole bunch of different ones there, social issues and different things that are popular today, and then we have some information about me and all that. But you go to kencoughlin.org, and you can actually, it's all searchable, and you can browse, search, whatever for something that you want more information about. I invite you to go ahead and check that out. All right. So with that being said, why don't we go ahead and get into what the topic of today is supposed to be. Now, the topic for today is one of those Bible difficulty ones. Did Moses order the execution of innocents? This is specifically dealing with a particular passage from the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 31. And the way this came about is I actually recorded a YouTube short, and that YouTube short is actually going to come out tomorrow at 4:00 p.m. Eastern time on the channel, responding to another YouTube short that I had seen with a gentleman named Aaron Ra. Aaron Ra is the host of the Ra Men podcast, and he is a member of the American Atheist Board of Directors. And he's spoken on Numbers 31 a number of times, but I just picked this particular YouTube short because this is what came up in my feed. And in this YouTube short, he's making a number of allegations about what we see in Numbers 31, and specifically that it looks like Moses is ordering the murder of a bunch of innocent people, and God's okay with Moses ordering the murder of a bunch of innocent people. And he does what a lot of atheists do, where he just throws a whole bunch of things out there. And it was far more than I could really respond to in a 60-second YouTube short, especially when the first 17, 18 seconds of that are taken up with a portion of his video. And so I figured, you know what? I think I'm going to go ahead and use tonight's podcast to respond to these points more in depth, and to, number one, show his full video so you get the benefit of that, and then go through them kind of one by one, because this is a passage that may have bothered some people, and even if you're not familiar with this particular passage, I guarantee you've probably seen some of the subjects that it deals with come up in the past. So before I dive into it, the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you the original YouTube short that inspired this whole episode. So give me a second. Here we go. Nope. Mouse is doing something funky. All right, let me go ahead and play this for you.
You mentioned Numbers 31, when Moses sent his people into Midian, what they did to the Midianites. So they raid the city. I mean, it's everything that the Vikings are supposed to be doing. And you charge in there, you tear everything up, you kill everybody, burn everything down, steal everything, charge into people's houses, kill mama, kill grandpa, kill dad, kill grandma. And then Moses gets angry that his people were being merciful to the women and the children. So he orders that all the little boys had to be slaughtered in front of their mothers, and that their mothers then had to be butchered in front of their daughters, and that all of the daughters, if they had not known a man by lying with him, if they were virgins, then they could be kept alive for yourselves. The virgins you can keep alive for yourselves.
Yep.
I don't know exactly what for yourselves means.
Yeah, you do.
This is the guy who's speaking for God now, right?
All right. So he raised a lot of things, a lot of objections in there, and I want to kind of go over it step by step, first with some general comments, and then we will deal specifically with some of the objections that he raises. First of all, you do see in this video an approach, a tactic that is all too common with a lot of skeptics out there. Obviously, there's an element of ridicule, and it wasn't the worst. I will tell you, I've seen a lot of skeptics, including some videos that I watched in preparation for the show tonight, that really pour on the ridicule and the mockery more than they did here. But there was a little touch of it there, and I just like to remind people whenever I see that mockery is not an argument. All right, laughing at people is not an argument. All right. Throwing insults at people is not an argument. Richard Dawkins, atheist Richard Dawkins, several years ago appeared at something called the Reason Rally. I think I might have mentioned this on a recent episode. I can't remember. Down in Washington, D.C., which was this big gathering of atheists and skeptics who claimed to be the party of reason. They're all about using reason, and those pesky little theists, they don't use reason at all. And I just can't believe nobody called this out. I mean, on the atheist side, that is, if you're really the party of reason. So Richard Dawkins gets up there on the stage and he encourages everybody. He says, I think you should go out there and you should mock Christians. You should make fun of them. You should ridicule them. And I'm like, there's a name for that in philosophical circles. It's called the ad hominem fallacy. All right. I mean, it's a textbook philosophy 101. You can be an undergrad in philosophy and know that this is a logical fallacy. It's where you attack the person rather than the message. All right. It's throwing insults. And here he was, someone who claims to be the party of reason, who was actually telling people they should do this. He's saying, we're the party of reason, but your primary attack should be one that's completely unreasonable. Essentially. And so I do try to remind people that using ridicule, using mockery is not an argument. If anything, from my perspective, it shows a weakness in your thinking. Because if you have to resort to that, I mean, if your argument is really as strong as you say it is, then just give me your argument. Show me through logical reasoning that it's a strong argument. But the moment you have to try to be a bully, like you're a bully on the schoolyard, and convince people that way, that shows me that maybe you don't have as much faith and confidence in the power of your argument as you claim you do. So there was a little bit of that in there. There was also something that I caution people against when they are watching atheists tell them what the Bible supposedly says. And that is that they don't always give you an accurate picture, all right? Many times when I see skeptics relay to me what the Bible says, they will do one of two things or maybe both. They will leave out key details, or they will add things, they will editorialize and add things that just aren't there. And so whenever you see someone, skeptic or otherwise for that matter, just kind of summarizing for you what the Bible says, instead of actually reading the words that are in Scripture, your radar should go up, your alarm bell should go up, that maybe they're not being honest with you. To give you one example here from what Mr. Ra just recited, he claimed that Moses ordered all these people be killed, daughters be killed in front of their mothers, or mothers be killed in front of their daughters, for example. And as you'll see in a second, no, he didn't. This whole idea of killing someone in front of someone else was never in the passage in Numbers 31. Mr. Ra literally just made that up. Why? Because obviously it carries more emotional impact. It's one thing to kill a person. It's another thing to kill a person in front of their kid, right? Well, nothing in the passage says to kill people in front of their kids. All right, Mr. Ra literally just made that up to try to tap into an emotional response rather than a logical or reasonable response. And again, I'm sorry to say it, but that demonstrates perhaps maybe you're not as confident in your argument as you think you are, because you feel like you have to resort to those types of tactics. All right, if you feel like you have to pull on people's emotions and generate an emotional response to get people to agree with you, then maybe you're not as confident that you can do it on purely logical grounds alone. Just saying. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to dive into this passage in more detail, and this is the actual passage itself. All right, Numbers 31, and we're looking at verses 13 through 18. This is what he was talking about, what he was summarizing for you. All right. It says, Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the community went to meet them, the Israelites, the rest of the Israelites, outside the camp. Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, who returned from the battle. This is just after a battle with the Moabites, just so you know the context here. We'll get more into the context shortly. Have you allowed all the women to live? He asked them. They were the ones who they were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man. But save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Obviously, in our modern culture and our modern sensibilities, there are some things in there that are going to bother us. And we'll get to those in a second. But I want to, while you're looking at this, and I apologize for the typo there in the end of verse 15. I was doing this very quickly. But you can see right there what I just told you. There is absolutely nothing in that passage about anyone being killed in front of anyone else. Mr. Ra literally just made that up. So again, when someone's just summarizing instead of showing you the actual scripture, be wary, all right? Be cautious. Always look it up yourself to see if they're being honest with you or not, because in this case, he wasn't being honest on that point. All right, so I mentioned that. Another thing that I want to kind of a broad kind of, I guess humorous is the best word to look at it, or to call it, is when atheists, when skeptics make objections like this, what are they saying? Right? They're saying God was wrong to do this. All right, God was morally wrong to allow this type of thing, or to order and command this type of thing. He did something that we think is morally odious. All right. In that case, what they're doing is they're judging God, right? They're acting as judge of God, saying, I am judging that God's actions in this instance were wrong, were morally wrong. But what I find hilarious is many times these same people will tell you that it is somehow morally wrong for God to judge us, right? Live and let live. You shouldn't judge. They quite frequently will misquote and misinterpret the whole idea about, get the log out of your own eye before you clear the speck out of your neighbors and all of that. And so I just find it interesting, maybe that's a better word, interesting, that many times these same folks who in one breath will say that it's not right for God to judge them, will then turn around and feel it's okay for them to judge God. If that alone doesn't make you think maybe your thinking might be backwards, I don't know what else will convince you. But that's just an interesting side note. As far as how to respond when someone brings these types of objections to the table, I do like, as a general rule, how Dr. Frank Turek tends to do it. He's with Cross-Examined Ministries. And many times when he's in a question and answer session, he doesn't even get into the specifics and breaking down these particular passages verse by verse, which I will do. I promise I'm going to get to that. But instead, he keeps it kind of general, and he says, well, okay, you say this was wrong of God to do. On what basis? On what authority? On what basis do you say that this was something that was morally wrong for God to do? All right, where are you getting this idea of right and wrong from? And he'll interact with someone, and inevitably it always ends up coming, the response is never ground objective morality. Let me explain to you what I mean by that, all right, in cute little pictures, all right? So here we have, we'll just call them, I don't know, Ken and BA, all right? Ken and BA, that sounds like a good couple of names, right? So BA is walking down the street, minding his own business, whistling a little tune, right? And all of a sudden, without any provocation, Ken jumps out of an alley and punches him in the face, all right? Now, BA then says, ow, all right? And then he claims that what Ken did was wrong. Now, in the first version of the scenario, I'm going to say BA claims that Ken was legally wrong. In other words, according to the civil laws of the land, BA is saying, I'm going to sue you, Ken, and I'm going to ask for damages because I think the laws of our land say that you were not legally allowed to do that. Well, so then let's say that Ken responds, no, I think I was legally right. BA says, no, I think you were legally wrong. You legally right, legally wrong. They go back and forth. how do they resolve this dispute? Well, fortunately, in our legal system, we have laws, right? We have law books. We can open up a law book and we can look at it and see, does it say who is actually legally right and who is actually legally wrong? And in this scenario, what's it going to say, right? It's going to say that BA is legally right. Ken did not have any legal authority to just out of the blue punch him in the face. All right? BA is going to win that case. And this is true regardless of opinion. It doesn't matter what each of them subjectively believes. Ken may legitimately think he was legally right. But when you open up that law book says, sorry, Ken, you were just mistaken, plain and simple. That's what's meant by an objective standard. There's an objective legal standard that tells us what the correct answer is, regardless of personal opinion. All right? Now, let's change the scenario ever so slightly. All right? Now, instead of BA saying that Ken was legally wrong in the sense of the civil laws of the land, he says, Ken, I think you were morally wrong. You were morally wrong to jump out of that alley and punch me. And Ken says, no, I was morally right. BA says, no, you were morally wrong. Morally right, morally wrong, morally right, morally wrong. They go back and forth. Is there a right answer in this scenario? Is there anything above them, above their independent opinions, that tells us what the actual moral law is? Understand, when someone says something like Mr. Ross said in this YouTube short, they are assuming that there is a standard above us. They are saying that there is a right answer. They're not just saying, hey, God did something in the Bible that I personally don't like. It's my opinion that I don't think it's a cool thing. But you know what? If other people think it's okay, then I guess there's no way to resolve this. It's just, maybe it is, maybe it's not. It's just up to our personal opinions. That's not what he's saying. He's saying what God was allowing here, what God was ordering here through Moses, was objectively wrong. All right? It is wrong regardless of personal opinion. All right? But where does that standard come from? With the civil law, we know we had these civil law books, right, that we could open up and look into to see what the answer is. Is there a moral law book? Well, excuse me. According to Christianity, the answer is yes. And I'm not going to go into all the breakdown of this. If you want to see, go to that website, kencoughlin.org, I told you about, and look up some of the resources under the moral argument for the existence of God. You can see in more detail where we say this comes from. But essentially, because God transcends all of us, God is higher than all of us, that God can be the source for morality. Whereas if you are an atheist, there is nothing higher than us. There's nothing higher in authority than humanity, right? And so you can't have an objective moral standard. So the way that Frank Turek addresses these questions when they come up is just taking it so far as to point out that the person who's raising this objection is assuming the existence of an objective moral standard. And he tries to get them to realize that without God in the picture, you don't have any basis for claiming that, for believing that. But you do believe it, which means you're assuming God does exist, whether you realize it or not. And if God does exist, and he says this was the moral rule, then we don't get to question it, basically, you know. And so that's one way you can approach it. Now, very few skeptics, just in the course of a simple conversation, I think will come that far as to actually acknowledge all of that. Some of them might start to realize they don't have a way to ground objective morality without God, but to realize that, no, that means you don't get to question when God says certain things like this are okay. Another kind of general response to these types of objections that come up is the observation that God has authority that we do not. See, lots of times when a skeptic or an atheist is raising this type of objection, like saying in Numbers 31, God is ordering things through Moses that are morally reprehensible. That's basically what they're saying, right? Not only are they assuming the existence of God and even saying that, because they're assuming objective morality exists, but they're assuming that things that are morally impermissible for us as humans to do must also be morally impermissible for God to do. And that is not true. Let me give you this analogy. If I have someone who is a suspected murderer and they're put on trial and they are found guilty, all right, the judge who's presiding over that case has, in many states, has the legal authority to sentence that defendant to death, to institute the death penalty for that person. However, I, as a private citizen, cannot just go out there and kill that person, even though they've been found guilty. I do not have the legal authority to execute that person as a private citizen, all right? Because there's a difference in authority between the judge and a private citizen. I would still face legal consequences for doing that because it was illegal for me to do so, all right? The same is true here. God is the author of life. God literally created life. And in fact, look, every single person who dies because it was God's will. All right, in some sense. That's a broader subject about the problem of evil and all that I'm not going to go into right now. But if someone dies from cancer, it's because God allowed them to die from cancer, right? If someone died in war, it's because God allowed them to die in war. And the reason is, like I said, God is the author of life. It is not the same thing for God to take a life as it is for us to take a life. Because God's the one who created life in the first place. It's at his discretion when someone lives and when their life ends. We did not create life, so it is not within our discretion to take it, all right? So that's another general response to this Numbers passage and frankly to any passage that is like it. All right, now let's get into some of the specific things that are mentioned in this particular passage. All right, so one thing that is commanded in this passage is Moses says that the Israelites should go out, all these women that they did not kill, you need to go kill them now, with some exceptions, right? Those who have not known a man, those who have not engaged in sexual intercourse, those they didn't have to kill, but these other women, they did have to kill. Now, understand something from the get-go. This was not the norm, all right? This alone should set an alarm bell. There's more going on here than Mr. Ra is letting on. That this was not the norm. Actually, the norm that God had commanded in Deuteronomy chapter 20 was that generally in warfare, the women, the children, all that were not to be killed. All right. We see this in Deuteronomy 20, 13, and 14. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves. We'll get into shortly what that means. It doesn't mean what a lot of these atheists accuse it of meaning or claim it means. And you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. All right. But what we see here, all right, is that the normal rule, the norm was that the women and the children were not to be killed. And yet in this Numbers 31 passage, we see that God is ordering them to be killed. Why the exception? Why the difference? Mr. Ra never goes into that, but that alone should make you start to wonder, I wonder if there's more going on here than he's letting on. All right, another thing that Mr. Ra conveniently does not tell you, because remember, he didn't actually read the passage, right? He just summarized it. He told you what he wanted you to hear about the passage. He emphasized only those aspects of it that he wanted you to know about. He didn't tell you about the parts he didn't want you to know about. And then as we've seen, he also embellished and added things that weren't even in there at all. What he did not tell you about was verse 16. What does verse 16 says? It says, referring to the women, all right? Referring to the women that had not been killed. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. All right. So what we see here is that, and you may not know what this is referring to yet, and we're going to talk about what it's referring to in a second, but at a minimum, you should be able to look at this and realize, well, wait a minute. So it's not just that God was saying it's okay to kill women after battle, right? You should kill all the women and children. It's that these particular women did something that God was enacting judgment for. He was enacting judgment upon them for some action that they took. All right. That's why we see a different rule here, because these particular people deserve to be punished for something that they did. This is another one where Mr. Ra in his YouTube short just completely misled you. He said in there that Moses got angry because the Israelites showed mercy on the women and children. Is that why Moses was angry? I mean, it's explicitly there in verse 16 that that's not why Moses was angry. He was not angry because they showed mercy. He was angry because they let criminals get away with their crime without being punished. All right? That's what he was angry about. For lack of a better word, these women committed a crime. God said to punish them for that crime, and the Israelites didn't punish them. All right? That's why Moses was angry, not because they showed mercy, and he didn't want them showing mercy. Mercy is a horrible thing. He lied. All right? Sorry, Mr. Ra lied to you about that portion of it. All right. So, we know that something was going on, and we're going to go in through and give you the background here in a second. I want to point out, I taught a class several years ago called Cracking Open the Hard Parts of the Bible. And the whole class, and I wrote a book for just that class, which one of these days I'll get published. I haven't done it yet. But the whole point of that class was how to, not just going through difficult passages, but creating a framework that allows you to investigate these difficult passages for yourself. And I gave a number of principles that you could follow when investigating difficult passages. One of them was this: always make sure we take in the entire textual context before coming to a conclusion. In other words, if someone like Mr. Ra here just is showing you an isolated passage and say, just look at these verses, only these verses, don't look at anything else. Again, your radar should go up, alarm bells should be ringing, all right? Because we always want to make sure we understand the entire context surrounding these verses, all right? So I showed you a few verses from chapter 31, but I specifically showed you verse 16 that showed you, hey, look, something happened that God was judging. If we follow this principle, we should then be asking, okay, what was it? Let me do some Bible study and figure out what it was that this was referring to. All right. So I will break my own rule here for a second, just out of time and necessity, but I will refer you to Numbers chapters 22 through 24, which I'm going to summarize. But I will tell you, again, I will encourage you, don't take my word for it. Go back when this podcast is over, read all of chapters 22 through 24 in Numbers. That gives you the background. Basically, what's going on in those chapters is we have this guy named Balaam, all right? Balaam is a prophet, but he's not a very good one, all right? He actually sells his services for money to the highest bidder. And so you have this king of Moab named Barak, all right? Now, Barak has seen some of the triumphs that Israel's having, right? And he's a little worried about Israel, the nation of Israel. He doesn't want them conquering him. And so he's trying to figure out a way, how can I defeat Israel? Well, hey, I know there's this prophet guy named Balaam, and his reputation is that, look, if he curses a certain group of people, then those people are cursed, right? And if he blesses a certain group of people, then those people are blessed. So here's my idea, mine meaning the king, right? I'm going to offer Balaam a whole bunch of money to curse the people of Israel. And then once he curses the people of Israel, then they'll be cursed and they'll be weaker, and I'll be able to attack them and I'll be able to conquer them. All right, this is his plan. So he goes to Balaam, and Balaam talks to God, goes back and forth a few times. But in the end, he does come along, and God tells him to go along with Barak. But what happens is every single time Barak tells Balaam, okay, curse the people of Israel. Instead, what comes out of Balaam's mouth is a blessing. All right? God makes Balaam bless the people of Israel instead of cursing the people of Israel. And this happens 3 times, right? 3 times Barak wants Balaam to curse the people of Israel. 3 times he ends up blessing them instead. This does not make Barak happy. All right? Then, let's see, this. Now, so then what happens after this is Barak, or Balaam, because I told you he's not a good prophet, right? So you understand that he's doing these things essentially because God's making him, not because he's a really good, loyal prophet of God. He actually tries to think, okay, so I've come to this conclusion that obviously I can't curse the people of Israel against God's will. He literally is not going to let me do that. Is there another way I can help King Barak to conquer the people of Israel? And he comes up with this idea. He says, I know what I could do. The whole reason why the people of Israel are so blessed and can't be conquered and they're winning everything is because they're honoring God, because that's what their covenant says. It says, if you keep worshiping me, you obey my commands, you obey the covenant, then you'll be blessed, right? And at this time, they were obeying the covenant, so they were being blessed. But he says, you know what you could do, Barak? You could entice them to disobey the covenant, right? You could entice them to not obey. And if they become disobedient to God, then guess what that covenant says will happen? They will not be blessed. They will now be under God's curse. So you get them to be disobedient to God, then under the terms of the covenant, they get cursed. Now you can go in and you can conquer them. All right. Now, I was watching one atheist video coming in. I'm not going to link it because it was filled with F-bombs and all sorts of profanity. But it just shows you the level of lack of research that goes into a lot of these things, is because he was criticizing a video that was put out by Jeffrey Winger, who's another Christian apologist, where Jeffrey Winger made the same point I just did. All right. And he says, that's just Jeffrey Winger making it up. The scripture never says that Balaam came up with this plan to curse the this plan to tell Barak to entice the people of Israel into this into disobeying God. And if he enticed them into the disobeying the people, the covenant of God, then they would no longer be under God's blessing but under God's curse. Really? First of all, remember that verse 16 that I told you that Mr. Ra conveniently forgot? Apparently this other atheist was just skipping over this verse as well, that it specifically says of the women, they were the ones who followed, whose advice does that say? Who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident. All right? Who followed Balaam's advice. It's explicitly there in verse 16. But that's not the only passage. It is also explicitly there in the book of Revelation. Revelation 2:14, this is Jesus through the revelation he gives to John, speaking to one of the churches, says, nevertheless, I have a few things against you. There are some among you who hold to the teaching of, again, who's that right there? Mr. Ra, who's that? Other atheist who I'm not naming right now, who's that? Balaam, who taught Balak, the king, to entice the Israelites to sin, so that they ate food sacrificed to idols and committed sexual immorality. Again, just because a skeptic tells you something about the Bible, do not take them at their word. All right. Like I said, this other video I was watching, he explicitly claimed that this was nowhere in Scripture. And there it is, 2 different places I've shown you where it explicitly is there, that Balaam went to Barak and said, hey, look, here's what you do. You get them to move away from obedience to God, and then they will be cursed. All right. And you can do it. It's explicitly there. All right. So, excuse me. So then what happened? Where do we see this? The actual incident itself is recorded in the book of Numbers 25. And here's what happens in Numbers 25. So this is the lead-in, right? Balaam's trying to curse the people of Israel at the suggestion of Balak. Balaam cannot do it. All right. So then Balaam comes to Balak and says, hey, instead, why don't you try enticing the people of Israel to be disobedient to God? Balak says, cool idea. And then we see it actually happen in Numbers 25. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women. Remember, we just saw in Revelation that this is exactly what the Moabites were trying to entice them to do, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. All right, same thing we saw in Revelation. The whole plan was to get these folks the Moabites were going to entice the Israelites into sexual immorality, to have sexual intercourse with their women, all right, and to worship other gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to Israel's judges, each of you must put to death those of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. All right. So this is the plan come to fruition, right? The people of Moabite and the Moabite women who are referenced later in the Numbers 31 passage. This is what they did. They went along with the plan. All right. King Balak said, here's the plan. These Moabite women said, cool, let's do it. And they charged in and they did it. All right. Committed a pretty egregious sin. All right. Now, more thing I want to say about this passage is one of those other principles that I brought up in that class I told you about, cracking open the hard parts of the Bible, was this. And that is just because, I should say the Bible, sorry, I put these together very, very quickly tonight. Just because the Bible records an action does not mean God condones that action. See this all the time. The reason I brought it up here was because specifically in Numbers 31, it never actually says that God condoned what Moses told the Israelites. But I think if we look at this passage from Numbers 25, we have to concede that yes, what Moses was telling the Israelites to do in chapter 31 was in line what God told him in chapter 25. So I think this is an important principle to obey and to follow. But I do think that in this particular instance, we have to agree that even though chapter 31 doesn't specifically mention God, if we look back at chapter 25, yes, this is a command that seems to be consistent with what was coming from God. But to give you an example of that same atheist that I told you that claimed that, the whole scheme between Balaam and Balak was never in Scripture, and, well, it was. He also tried to claim, and we'll get to this in a minute, about that this chapter 31, all is God condoning sexual slavery. And he said sexual slavery occurs throughout the Bible. And he gave the instance of Abraham. And Abraham forced his servant Hagar to have a child by him. See, sexual slavery condoned by the Bible. Well, again, we look back at that principle, right? Just because the Bible records an action does not mean God condones that action. I admit, when I was watching this video, I actually started laughing at this part because I'm like, seriously? I mean, this is the example you're using? Because his argument was, look, God condones sexual slavery. And the evidence he was using for that was because Abraham committed sexual slavery when he got his servant Hagar to have a child by him presumably without her consent. I said, that's your example? Anybody who's familiar with that story knows that God did not exactly condone that, did he? This was an example of Abraham not having adequate faith in God's promises, because God promised Abraham he would have offspring by his wife Sarah. This was an example where Abraham was messing up, right? God didn't condone that. But this is, so anyway, so this is why that principle becomes important, that just because the Bible records an action doesn't mean God condoned it. The Bible records that Abraham, who's one of the fathers, right? The founders of the faith, held in high regard in many regards, still screwed up, right? And it records that honestly. He did something that God did not condone. Just like David, right, after God's own heart, committed adultery. God did not condone that. Just because it's recorded in the Bible does not mean it's something that God agrees with. All right. So anyway, that's why I bring that up. But in this instance, in Numbers 31, I do think we have to concede that point because of what's in Numbers 25. All right. So that being said, it's in this context, all right, this is now the background that leads us up to this passage in Numbers 31. All right. And again, these are the words, I read them to you before, but this is the troubling part. This is what Moses said to the people of Israel after they came back from this battle with Moab. Have you allowed all the women to live? He asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. That was God's punishment for the Israelites giving in. All right. So now you see what the context is. This wasn't God saying, just go out and kill all the women and children after you conquer a people. In regard to the women, and we'll get to the children in a minute, in regard to the women, it was these particular people had committed an egregious sin that God decided in his sovereignty to judge them for, to enact judgment on behalf for them committing the sin. And he commanded the people of Israel to be his agents of that judgment, and they disobeyed him. All right? These women did something wrong. Just like if someone commits a crime today, they deserve to be punished for it. They did something wrong. God says they deserve to be punished for it. All right? That's the context that we see in here. These women also, now the other part, then we get into the last verse 18. Again, I'll come back to the kill of the boys in a minute, but the second half of verse 17 and verse 18 says, and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has not slept with a man. And of course, the skeptics, and you saw a little bit of this in the YouTube short I showed you, automatically say, oh, ooh la la, kind of thing. Oh, look, this is something where they're trying to keep for themselves these pure virgins so they can have sexual slaves from these pure virgin women, but the ones that weren't virgins, they're not as pure. We want to get rid of them. Do you understand now, reading in context and the history behind this incident, what's really going on here? It has nothing to do with getting sex slaves out of pure virgins, all right? It has to do with the fact that the women who were not virgins were the ones who had committed this sin. Whereas guess what? If you were a virgin, obviously you didn't have sex with the Israelite men, did you? All right? So God is separating them based on who committed the sin, who deserves judgment, and who didn't commit the sin that deserves judgment. He's not punishing people who didn't commit the sin. That's what's going on here. Now, I do want to get into this issue of save for yourselves, right? Save for yourselves. It says in there, but save for yourselves. And the suggestion, both from this YouTube short that we just watched and others, is that, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to hit that button. We'll come to that in a second. Boop. There we go. Is that save for yourselves, all right, means take these young virgin women and bring them in and have them as your sex slaves for the rest of your life. All right. Excuse me. First of all, let's looking back at that passage. Let me bring that back up again here for a second. Sorry, I got a lot of slides. It takes me a second to get to them. All right. Looking back at this passage, where does it say anything about sex slavery? I mean, that's what they're suggesting. That's certainly what was suggested by that YouTube short I showed you, and it was suggested by that other video I keep referencing, is that this is a passage where God is allowing sex slavery. Show me where it says that. What they're doing is they're interpreting those words, save for yourselves, to mean sex slavery. And I'm sorry, but interpreting those words, save for yourselves, as meaning sex slavery, says more about the mind of the person doing the interpreting than it does about the mind of God. There's nothing in those words in English, and there's nothing in those words in Hebrew that requires or mandates or somehow says that this must be referring to save them to be your sex slaves. It's just not there. As a lot of people say, get your mind out of the gutter. All right. Scripture does have other passages that talk about, what the life of people that were taken into servitude, for example, after being conquered. Now, first thing I want to say and I want to point out is this passage I accidentally brought up before. Numbers 21. Get my right thing here. I'm sorry. No, Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 11. This talks about some of what can happen to people after a battle, right? It says, when you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives, all right, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. So this was giving the Israelites, even though normally they were not to intermarry, right? Hebrew had to marry other Hebrews, Jew had to marry another Jew. This is saying, well, but here's an exception to that rule. If you go to war with another nation and you bring in captives and you bring in female captives and you see someone there that you would like as a wife, you are allowed to marry this foreigner who came in and is now a captive. Why is that? All right, give me 1 second here. There we go. I want to make sure I got this right. I got a lot of slides, trying to keep them all straight. All right. I've seen a lot of people object to this passage and say, well, this is still sex slavery because, look, you're bringing a woman who you just captured against her will and making her into a wife. And so I saw somebody say, well, there's no consent there. And to some extent, you gotta agree. Yeah, the marital laws and the way they existed at the time did not exactly promote female sovereignty over their own decisions, did they? Right? But here's the problem, and again, this is the same atheist who that longer video I keep referencing that I was watching. He kept saying that, it didn't have consent. And he took issue with Mike Winger when Mike Winger said that the laws that God laid down, like this one, allowing the Hebrew men to marry these women, were actually increasing women's standing in society. We're actually giving them more power and more authority than they previously would have had. And what this gentleman who did this video kept doing is he kept basically comparing the sovereignty and the power that a woman has today and acting like that's the degree of authority and power they had back then, and saying, look, so when God enacts this law saying that Hebrew men can marry these women, he was taking away their right to consent. He was taking away certain rights that these women had. The response to that is he wasn't taking away squat because they didn't have those rights at that time in that culture to begin with. He was giving them rights they did not have. Being the wife of a Hebrew male actually gave women many rights that they would not otherwise have had, and they certainly did not have in their Moabite society, okay, in Moabite culture. For example, if you married a Hebrew woman, you had to treat her actually as a wife. You couldn't just treat her as a servant. You had to give her all the rights that a wife had, rights of inheritance, rights of, for example, if you decide to divorce her, well, you can't just divorce her, all right? You got to set her up so she's able to provide for herself and set her free in that instance. So there was a lot of rights that women would get as a result of this law that they did not have under the Moabite culture and the Moabite system. The same was true. Now, I will also say that it's also fair to say, though, wait a minute, but not all these women became wives. True enough. All right. True enough. If they didn't become a wife, what would they become? They would become a servant. All right. And so, well, what about servants? What were the rights of servants? It's a pet peeve of mine. I think that too many people, and Bible translations do this as well. They use the word slave instead of servant to translate the original Hebrew. And the reason I think that's problematic is when that word obviously has certain expectations, certain connotations, certain baggage that it comes with in our modern culture because of the antebellum slavery in the South. And so we naturally assume that when the Bible talks about slavery, it is referring to an institution that is similar to what we had in the American South before the Civil War. And that's just not true. It's just not true. There were a number of rights that servants had in Hebrew society, at least if they were following God's law, that make it not a parallel to what we had in the antebellum South, and also make it not a parallel with the surrounding nations around them. For example, to give you a few examples, if a person became a servant to a master in Israel, all right, that master was not just allowed to receive the benefit of that person's labor, but they had to take care of that person, and they had to take care of that person's family, all right? So if it was a male servant, they had to take in the wife, kids, anything like that as well, and they had to make sure that they had food, they had shelter, they had clothing. All of that fell upon the master. Also, we see, for example, in the book of Job, Job talks about how he always treated his servants fairly when they took him to court. Think about that for a second. In Israel, servants, or slaves as some translators like to use it, had the right to take their masters to court for grievances. That definitely did not exist in the antebellum South, and it did not exist in the nations surrounding Israel, that they could bring a legal complaint against their master. And another one last one I'll mention here is that, let me find the actual passage here. Exodus 21, 26 through 27. I don't have a slide for this one. It says, an owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. An owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. So understand, if you so much as knock a tooth out of your slave, slave's free. Slave is free. And you got to set him up, like I said before, and let him go. So understand that I am not, and no Christian apologist is ever claiming that the rights that women enjoyed at that time were God's ideal. They absolutely were not. But what was going on here is God is working with cultures that are very, they're very sexist, right? They're very much in favor of male-dominated cultures, right? He's working within that situation, and he wants to move them to a place of recognizing the equal worth of the two genders, right? The equal value of the two genders. Well, how does he go about doing that? One way he could go about doing that is just saying, this is my rule, follow it. Go for it. From now on, you have to treat everybody equally. You have to have women in the priesthood. You have to have women politicians and all this kind of stuff. He could have done that. And I know it's what a lot of people would like to see him do. Would that have yielded the results that he wanted? Anyone who's familiar with the Old Testament knows that it is a story of God commanding the Jews to do something and them saying, oh, sure, we'll do it. And then them not doing it and becoming disobedient until the curses come down, and then they say, oh, we're sorry, we're going to do that. And they do it for a short while, and then they don't do it again. You don't enact long-lasting cultural change. You don't affect long-lasting heart change, changing people's hearts, by fiat, by just commanding them to do certain things. Yes, God gives us commands to outline his morality, but when he wants to affect long-term change, what he'll do is he'll take baby steps. He will lay down rules like we see throughout. There is no slave or free, like we see in the New Testament. But he will also say, hey, look, here's how you need to treat people. And he says, you know how all the surrounding cultures and how you've been treating women? No, you got to give them these extra rights too. You got to do this for them that the other cultures aren't doing, that you haven't been doing. He might not in that command at that time have taken it all the way, but he would lay down general principles that we can start to see, oh, wait a minute. If we're actually being true to these general principles, then we need to take this even further than what God told these people in their culture thousands of years ago, and realize, no, that was something that God intended to grow, that God intended to develop. All right, so God did, through these marriage laws, through the treatment of servants, etc., he did start the ball rolling to bring them to a place where people eventually realize, no, we shouldn't be having servants. We should be treating everybody equally. That's a broader conversation that I really have time to go through now because we're already like an hour into this podcast. But if I were to sum it up, the point is this, is that too many atheists compare the plight that foreign women had at the time and act like they had the same rights and privileges that they enjoy today. So that when God laid down these rules we see in the books of Deuteronomy, in the books of Numbers, that God was taking something away from them. He was taking rights away from them. But this ignores the historical cultural context of the time. If you understand that in reality at the time they didn't have anywhere near the rights that women enjoy today, all right, that God actually was improving their situation based upon what they have before, and he was laying down general moral principles so that that improvement would continue over time until we get to the point of recognizing their equal value. All right. So we are almost gone through everything that we see here. Let's go on to this one. Verse 17, now kill all the boys. That's a tough one, isn't it? Now kill all the boys. How are we to understand that command from Moses to the Israelites? It didn't just tell them to go out and kill the women who had actually engaged in this sin. But he said, you've killed the men. I want you to kill the women, but only those women who committed the sin and deserve judgment for it. But he also said, kill all the boys. Why? Well, first thing, let me see, make sure I'm remembering correctly about what my next slide is. Let's do this one next, actually. Another one of those principles that I mentioned in that class I taught about cracking open the hard parts of the Bible is that sometimes our failure to understand a difficult passage is because we are missing some nuance from the original language or the historical, cultural context in which the action takes place. In other words, sometimes we read something in our English translation, all right, in our modern sensibilities, and we think it means one thing. But the problem is it really doesn't mean that thing, because the people who originally heard this thousands of years ago when it was written in its original language would have understood it to mean something different. And the fault is in us, because what we are doing is we are imposing our modern cultural presuppositions and understandings upon a text that was not written in the modern era, right? So let me show you what I mean by this. The words that are used in this passage in Hebrew, and I'm not a good pronunciator of Hebrew, all right? But it's actually two words, all right, to mean boys. When it says to go kill all the boys, what is translated as boys is actually the word zakar, which means male, and tafaf, which, again, I'm probably mispronouncing and I apologize, which literally means to take small, quick steps. All right. It's often translated as children because, well, they have shorter legs, right? So they take small, quick steps. So literally what this word means is males who take small, quick steps. So Moses was saying, go kill males who take small, quick steps. All right. Interestingly, though, there is another word in Hebrew for babies or infants. All right. And that is the word tanakh. That word is not used here. So understand, Moses is not saying to kill all male children. He's drawing an age distinction here. Now, where that cutoff is a question for debate, but he is definitely not saying go kill all of the children. He's saying the younger children, he didn't use the word he would have used if he meant literally kill all of the babies. All right? So there's some kind of cutoff there. What we need. So that's the original languages part. The other thing we can be misunderstanding is something about the historical, cultural context in which the action takes place. In other words, what was the culture at the time? What was happening? Well, you have to understand the cultures at that time in Israel and the surrounding nations were what we call clan-based cultures, all right? Everybody, you have your own clan, and you live for that clan, you die for that clan, you do anything for that clan, all right? And young boys, and I'm talking like adolescent boys, for example, were actually educated and instituted with the values, even quite often the violent values, of their clan, of their culture, at a very, very young age. We still see this in many clan-based cultures today, and many similar cultures today. A couple of examples for you. ISIS in Syria and all of that, when that was going on, there were a number of reports of U.S. servicemen who would report that young boys were actually used as suicide bombers, that young boys would have bombs strapped to them under their clothing, and they would approach U.S. service members in convoys, whatever. Why? Because ISIS was explicitly exploiting the fact that, according to our Western sensibilities, we see that young boy as an innocent, and that would allow them to get closer to the service members and set off the explosive. But in reality, those young boys had already been indoctrinated into the worldview of their culture at that time, and they were already very, very dangerous and would do what they could do within their means. Another example, that's a more modern example. I don't know if anybody's been following this particular aspect of the story, but a number of children's programming in Palestine has come out that ever since Hamas took over, and again, I'm criticizing, just to be clear, I'm criticizing Hamas here, not necessarily the Palestinian people as a whole, all right? But Hamas took control, and they were voted in, and then they refused to give up their power. And it's just shocking to watch, like, on their entertainment that they're putting out there for children. The children's programming, you have cartoons that is being shown to children in Gaza, all right, that depicts Palestinians murdering Jews. And yay, how cheerful it is. It's all happy to kill this Jewish person and dance in their blood and stomp on their head. To children, all right? This is the type of culture that we saw in Moab at that time and in the surrounding pagan nations. We look at these passages and we look at them through a 21st century lens, and we have this idea that children are naive, children are innocent. That's not the culture at the time. These young boys were already being raised to be extremely violent and to have hatred towards anyone outside of their clan. So even if they could not have done any widespread damage at that time, although in modern days we do see, like the example of ISIS I just gave you, where young boys are being used to do widespread damage, they certainly were going to when they grow up. They certainly would be enacting revenge. You see example after example after example of this in the ancient world, that if someone did something wrong to your clan while you were a kid and you were allowed to live to become a full-grown man, that you were then going to try to take revenge on the people who wronged your clan when you were a child. That was part of the culture at that time. You may not like it. I don't like it. We admit we don't like it. But you can also see where when Moses is telling them to kill the young boys, all right, not the babies again, the young boys, this is why. Because you don't have juvenile detention centers, okay, in ancient Israel. These boys, if allowed to continue to live, would most certainly pose a threat to Israel, all right? That is the way their culture worked at that time. All right, let me see here. Nope, that's it. All right, so I'm going to see if I can pull up the whole passage here again, just to kind of look at it in context. All right, so what have we learned here today? This was the passage in total that was objected to as showing God's complete immorality, all right? Where Moses went to the people of Israel after they came back from the Battle of Moab, and they said, have you allowed all the women to live? They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. And then he commanded them, go out and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. What we have seen going through this is, number one, to the historical context, what God was doing here was punishing egregious sin. He was separating the women into two groups: those who had committed the sin and deserved to be punished, and those who hadn't committed the sin and therefore were innocent of this and did not deserve to be punished. All right? He was not telling the Israelites that they could take the women that were not killed, that they could take them as sex slaves. As a matter of fact, he specifically said elsewhere they could take them as wives if they wanted to, or they could be servants. And either one of those scenarios, all right, actually elevated the number of rights that they had in that fallen, imperfect culture and society at the time. And then we also saw with verse 17 about going out and killing all the boys, that the context of that was a very different culture from what we have today. They were a clan-based culture where this is not talking about the youngest of the young. This is talking about adolescent boys who were already being indoctrinated and trained in the violence of their culture, of their clan. And they did, in fact, pose as much of a threat as they physically could have at that time. And if allowed to grow into full full maturity, they certainly would have posed an even more egregious threat at that time. Again, you don't have to like it, and it isn't going to sit well with us because that's not the culture we live in, at least here in the West. Like I pointed out, there are cultures in the Middle East where that is still very much the culture, all right? And so I think maybe some people in the Middle East might actually understand this command more than we do here in the West. But hopefully, at least diving into a little bit of the history of it and diving into the culture as it was at that time gives you a little more insight into what exactly was going on here. All right, this has been a long episode. And I think my wife's going to be calling me in about 15 minutes saying she's ready to leave. So I am going to wrap this whole thing up. Thank you very much for joining us here this evening. I will say again, just as a quick reminder, if you have a question you would like to see on a future episode of Hey Ask Me Stuff, here's what you do. You go to this YouTube channel, trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff. Put your question there in that form. We will go through all the questions that are submitted and pick them for future episodes. Hope to see your question on a later episode. Also, just a quick reminder, if you want to see some of the many resources that I've accumulated over the years, you can go to kencoughlin.org. Everything's free, nothing behind a paywall. Everything is organized topically. You can search it, find something you're looking for. And you know what? If you've got any questions, if you watch one of those videos, read one of those articles, whatever's on that website, and it spurs on a question, then go to that page with a form and submit it for a future episode here of Hey Ask Me Stuff. All right. Thank you all very much for joining us here this evening. We will be back again next Tuesday, 6:30 p.m. with special guest Chris Boggs, our worship leader, who will be joining us to talk about is there a minimum standard for worship music? Hope to see you then. Until that time, God bless.